this up by talking about Carter's human rights and foreign policy. In general, Carter's major goals of preserving human rights, some people see as eclipsing his ability to effectively deal with some of the foreign policy crises that crept up on him towards the end of his presidency. So one of the things that both Ford and Carter were dealing with was the general American disillusionment with what happened in Vietnam. And so what we see is that by the 1970s, the United States is not as dominant on an international front. And one of the major reasons why that is because the general American public didn't want to have another Vietnam. They didn't see the point in having these proxy Cold Wars that sort of had senseless American casualties, and that already we've seen has contributed to the deterioration of the relationship between the American people and government. All right, so one way in which already the president was restricted in his war powers was the War Powers Act of 1973. So this was sort of a reaction against both Johnson and Nixon's military policies. So what the War Powers Act did was it forced there to be more consultation with Congress before the president could just freely send troops into an area. So for example, if there was a military conflict that lasted for more than 60 days, Congress had to authorize it, or it had to extend the deadline. So basically what we see is that, unlike what happened with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that the president couldn't just send troops into an area for an indefinite period of time. That's really one of the major differences we see in, this late 20th century warfare from the previous definition of warfare in the U.S. We normally had to have an agreement between both between Congress and the president to go to war, but it seems like in the late 20th century, the executive branch really grew in power, and that's what the War Powers Act was trying to counteract. So again, what we see is that because there was such a high level of military spending, and also the economy in general was declining, with stagflation, the Americans are not really able to compete with their economic rivals anymore. So increasingly what we're going to see is that Americans are going to start to rely on deficit spending to try to sustain their war expenses. And this obviously is going to, again, contribute to a general sense that, continuing the Cold War mentality was very difficult because it was sort of sacrificing Americans' economic livelihood at home. So what we start to see is that some presidents in the 1970s are going to make increasing efforts to establish a slightly more positive relationship with the Soviet Union and even China. So we're seeing some sort of thawing of Cold War tensions in the 70s. That is until 1979, and then we'll talk about how things change. Right, so for example, even when Nixon was president, this was Ford, my bad, 1979 is Ford, or 1975, is Ford, right, with the Helsinki Accords. There goes my brain. So in 1975, we have a bunch of major leaders meet in Helsinki, Finland, and the agreement there was that the Soviets would work more to respect human rights in the regions that were under their influence. So that was seen as a major victory for the people who were involved there, and it was seen as a way in which, again, Cold War tensions could thaw a little bit. And then also we see that in the 1970s where there were a series of negotiations with the USSR to try to limit the amount of nuclear capabilities that both countries had. So, for example, in 1972, when Nixon was president, we had the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or the SALT Treaty. The first one was ratified. So this contributed to a future anti-ballistic missile treaty, and it started to limit the number of nuclear arms that a country could possess. But in 1970, that should be 1979, my bad, 1979, everybody, all right. That's when SALT II was negotiated. Now, it was agreed by Carter, the SALT II negotiations, but by the time it got to the Senate, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, so the Senate refused to ratify the SALT II SALT II treaty, rather. So that sort of shows us the limits with which the Cold War tensions were able to thaw during Carter's presidency. As I was saying before, Carter is really committed to promoting human rights worldwide. He does this in many ways by trying to work through the UN, oftentimes trying to impose economic sanctions on countries that have gross violations of human rights. In some instances, he rejected some of the previous administration's efforts to support authoritarian dictatorships when they were trying to fight communism. So, for example, you might remember the 1953 coup in Guatemala or the 1973 coup in Chile. Carter believed that neither of those were a good idea. And so we see that Carter seems to be promoting the outlook of civilians in these countries more than sort of enforcing Cold War policies. He also required his Secretary of State to report on human rights conditions in every country that received American aid, and he claimed that the U.S. could withdraw aid in any country that had gross human rights violations. Carter was the first U.S. president to openly speak out against the apartheid policy in South Africa, and he opposed economic sanctions on countries that committed human rights violations. And he also received some success in getting the CIA to help return the Panama Canal Zone to Panama. So that was seen as a foreign policy success. And the other major foreign policy success that Carter took credit for was the Camp David Accords. So basically what those were a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. This does not bring stability to the Middle East, to the Israel area, to the Egypt area, but what it does do is, this is one of the first times an Arab country actually recognizes Israel as a state. So what happens is that Carter invites both the Prime Minister of Israel and the leader of Egypt to the Camp David presidential retreat outside of D.C. And what they do is they negotiate this peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. The agreements that they come to, they decide to return the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and then Egypt in turn accepts Israel's existence. But one of the continuing problems is that we're not quite sure what the status of Palestinians who are living in the growing state of Israel is going to be. So again, the idea is that even if there is peace now between Egypt and Israel, it doesn't mean that the entire Middle Eastern region is in a better position. So as you can see, this map here shows us that Israel was continuing to expand, right? We see that the green part of the map shows us Israel before 1967, and then you see the expansion of Israel into the previous state of Palestine, and then also you see the area that Israel ceded to Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, right? So Carter claimed a big success by achieving the Camp David Accords, but there were limits to how much Middle Eastern peace he was able to achieve. What we see also is that there's going to be an increase in the Cold War rivalry as the 1970s press on. One example, first off, we see that the U.S. actually is developing more positive relationships with China. This is an image of Jimmy Carter meeting with the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. And so when China starts to get along better with the Soviet Union, that actually increases the tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S., right? So we're also going to see that there's going to be a little bit of a new arms race proliferating. The U.S. adopts new forms of missiles called MX missiles, and it also starts creating Trident submarines. We'll see images of those in just a second. As we already know, in 1979, the SALT II treaty fails to be ratified. And this is largely in response to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. And like I was saying before, again, the improved relationship between the U.S. and China is bad for the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. Okay, so again, these are just images. This is pretty cool of some of the new military technologies that kind of revive the arms race between the U.S. and the USSR. So these are Trident submarines, and those were these are the MX satellites here. Pretty cool, very powerful, very long range. So those were the things that continued to make the Soviet Union nervous. Okay, so again, the policy of détente, that relaxing of tensions that we saw under Nixon, is officially going to come to an end in 1979 when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. What we're going to see is that the U.S. is very nervous about this attack. They feel that, first off, the Soviet Union is trying to increase its influence over the Middle East, which very much makes the U.S. nervous because, of course, as we know, the U.S. is very dependent on the oil sources there. So what we see is that the U.S. does a number of things to try to explain to Russia how they feel about this new move. So first off, they issue some economic sanctions on Russia. One of the things they do is they stop shipping grain there. And so, I mean, this is exemplified in this Time magazine article here. It's literally, they called it a grain war. Basically, they were trying to make Russia more desperate for this food supply, and they also stopped shipping technology supplies to Russia. So basically, they were trying to, use boycotts as a method to stop their military aggression. They also boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980. So again, we see that this is definitely a good example of a sense of how nationalism plays into this rivalry, right? Because the Olympics were really a sign of international nationalism, and by refusing to attend, the U.S. sent a really strong message to the Soviet Union as well as to other participating countries in the Olympics. And then also the U.S. directly aids Afghan fighters. They were called freedom fighters, and you see one here. So basically the idea was that the U.S. is directly getting involved in trying to help the opposition to the Soviet Union. And one of the unfortunate byproducts of the U.S. helping the Afghans in this conflict, again, think synthesis, the Afghanis actually were able to use some of the weapons that they got from the U.S. In this time period against the United States in the future. So it's actually bad. Basically, the U.S. doesn't realize that it, in the long run, is supplying its future enemies with weapons. So basically what we see is that by the end of Carter's administration, we are in an even heightened sense of Cold War. So just giving us a sense of the location here, you can see where Afghanistan is located. This is what makes the U.S. nervous. Realize that Afghanistan borders Iran. It's pretty close to Iraq. It's close to Kuwait, right? These are all oil-rich areas. And so the U.S. is nervous that this is an example of the Soviet Union sort of flexing its muscles over Middle Eastern territory. These are also images of Afghan freedom fighters here. The Iran hostage crisis was the last really significant foreign policy blunder. That's probably one of the major reasons why Carter was not reelected in 1980. So what happens is that, first off, there was a overall tense relationship between the U.S. and Iran ever since the 1950s. Because in the heat of the Cold War, way back when Truman was president, the U.S. got the CIA involved in overthrowing the democratically elected president of Iran. So when they get him overthrown, they impose a Shah on the throne, a guy from the Pahlavi family. Okay, so basically the dude who was ruling Iran ever since 1953 was a guy that the CIA put into power, right? Not the Iranian people. So already there was this general sense of resentment towards the U.S. and that they were interfering with Iranian democracy in order to try to promote their Cold War policies, right? So what happens is that in 1979, the Iranian Revolution takes place, and they get rid of the Shah. So they get rid of the guy who was placed in power by the United States. And then they bring a new leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, into power, right? So the Ayatollah Khomeini was the person that the Iranians wanted in power. And then the Shah, who was deposed from Iran, actually was ill with cancer at this point, so he ends up going to the U.S. to get medical treatment. And when he does that, the Iranians take that as an insult because, not only does it seem as though the U.S. Is continuing to back this leader that they just kicked out, but it's sort of an affront to the Iranian democracy, to their newly established government, because the U.S. is treating this former Shah in such a positive way, right? They sort of want, the Iranians want the U.S. to recognize the Iranian democracy by ignoring the Shah, which they don't do. So basically, the Iranians respond by essentially committing an act of terrorism. They end up storming the U.S. embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran, and they take over 50 American hostages from the U.S. Embassy. And these hostages are held for over a year. They're held for 444 days. Really, really long time. This is significant because Carter was unable to successfully negotiate to get these hostages back. He tried just diplomatic negotiations at first, and they failed. And then he ended up trying to send helicopters into the region, but the helicopters crashed. And so what we see is that all of Carter's attempts to get these hostages back fail, which makes Carter look really weak at home, and it also makes the United States in general look weak abroad. And so in some ways we can connect some of a lot of the sentiments of Middle Eastern resentment towards the United States all the way back to this period. And so if we think about the current climate still of the US with the Middle East, we can really, if we want, connect it all the way back to the Iranian hostage crisis, the Iranian Revolution, and maybe even way back to the 1953 establishment of the Pahlavi Shah on the throne, right? The CIA established this. So way back ever since the 1950s, at the very least, Iran is not particularly happy with the U.S. Cold War policies. So basically, in general, it is seen that the Iranian hostage crisis, the failure of Carter to get these hostages back, contributed to his huge decline in popularity, and it's one of the major reasons why he wasn't reelected in 1980. These are the crashed helicopters that tried to fly into Tehran to save the hostages. And what's interesting is that the hostages were actually freed the same day that Reagan was sworn into office. And so that really contributes even more to the general popularity of Reagan. So we like to say that really this is a long legacy of presidential failures ever since the 1960s. It seems like there is this long-standing chain of presidents that disappointed the American public, from Johnson not being completely honest with his public about escalation in Vietnam, to Nixon and the Watergate scandal, to Ford and stagflation, to Carter and continuing inflation and his blunders in foreign policy. And so in general, it really seems like anything that Carter was able to do, for example, with expanding human rights, like with the return of the Panama Canal to the Panamanians, the Camp David Accords, anything positive that he did in foreign policy was sort of overshadowed by the failures in the Iranian Revolution, in the invasion of Afghanistan, and just in the fact that inflation was still skyrocketing. So really, this is sort of paving the way for the conservative ascendancy that we're going to talk about in the next videos. So that is why Reagan is going to be elected in 1980. He was seen as a president that could sort of restore that general sense of confidence. But we will analyze the extent to which that is true. Think about Reagan's economic policies, how they sort of conflicted with his increased defensive spending. And we can evaluate what kind of impact that this return to conservatism had on the general status of the United States. So thanks for listening to these. We only have the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton videos left, so we're almost done here. All right, and then we'll review for that AP exam. All right, thanks, guys.